a very warm welcome to all of you to this our first session of the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence Research Conference 2022, Healing and Harm, Intersections of Trauma, Justice, and Scripture. My name's Ashley Hibbard, and I'm a research associate with the CSBV, and I'll be emceeing the proceedings this week. For those of you who may be less familiar with the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence, maybe this is your first interaction or your first conference with us, let me just very briefly introduce who we are and what we do. The CSBV was launched in 2018 by Baptist minister and Old Testament specialist Dr. Helen Painter, initially to help the church and the academy both develop strong answers to some of the questions of violence in Scripture, particularly divinely commanded violence, such as issues in the Canaanite conquest. But our vision very soon broadened to include not only the violent texts of Scripture, but also the use of the Bible in a violent world, looking at questions of how Scripture has been used to perpetuate violence and oppression, or at times to bring peace and wholeness, or sometimes both. Helen continues to lead the center with the help of several research associates who assist in part-time. If you're interested in checking out things that we have to offer beyond the conference, our blog is a great place to start. We have a podcast called Guns and God that has many excellent episodes, looking primarily at issues of Christianity and the radical right. And very, very soon, though I'm aware I said this last year, we hope to release our first issue of the Journal for the Study of Bible and Violence, which will be a peer-reviewed, open-access online journal, academic journal, that we hope will publish high-quality articles and book reviews to stimulate further research and conversation. So turning to this session in particular, our first two conference sessions are focused more on the areas of trauma and the biblical text. And this one is entitled Trauma and the Use of the Bible. Our session chair will be introducing our speakers formally, so let me introduce him. Brandon Hurlbert is finishing up his PhD in Theology and Religion at the University of Durham. His dissertation is entitled Sanctioning Sacrilege Towards Rereading Judges as Christian Scripture. He's a research associate at the CSBV and a regular contributor on the Two Cities podcast. His recent publications include Cut and Splice, Reading Judges 19 Cinematically in Biblical Interpretation, and Alternate Eyes, Perspective Shifting in the Samson Narrative, and Black Mirror in Theology and Black Mirror. Not a book title I ever thought I'd see, which is just out this month. If you happen to be a Twitter user, please do feel free to live tweet through the conference. In fact, we'd be delighted if you'd do that. The hashtag will be CSBVCon22. I'll put that in the chat box in just a moment. Now, before we get a real beginning, at CSBV, we are very aware that the questions we address, whether of ancient violence or modern, are not simply academic issues, but that there are real people at the heart of these issues and real suffering. So we like to begin by acknowledging this, by honoring those who have suffered and who are suffering. And it's become our tradition at the conference to begin each session with the lighting of a candle. And I'd ask us to keep silence for about 30 seconds. And then I'll put it nearby where you'll be able to see it burning through the remainder of this session. Over to you, Brandon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Ashley. So our session tonight, I'm really excited to kick off our conference with a session on trauma and the use of the Bible. A few things before we begin. This session will feature 2 presentations that will last about 40 minutes each. After each one, I'll open it up for a time of Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we'll have a short comfort break in between the 2 presentations. If you'd like to be inputting questions into the chat during the presentation, that's wonderful. Please do so. When it comes time for Q&A, I'll kind of scroll back through and find questions. And depending on the type of question, I might ask you to unmute yourself and you can ask our speakers your question directly. I also want to make clear up front that this, if you haven't already figure this out, this is a conference on trauma and justice. And I think it's safe to say that all of our sessions come with a content warning. There may be topics and events discussed tonight and during the rest of the conference that some might find too upsetting to discuss or listen to. And that is perfectly understandable. We want to be sensitive to those issues. So if you feel like the conversation is getting too heavy and you need to step away for a minute or even mute us, please feel empowered to do so. We want this to be an enjoyable and restorative type of conference for you. And just a final quick note, our first presenter, Dr. June Dickie, has had quite the adventure getting us her presentation. She's not only traveling at the moment, but she's also recovering from COVID and even fighting for Wi-Fi. So she's actually pre-recorded her presentation that I'll play in just a moment. And I hope that she'll be able to respond in real time. I know she is here this evening. And I hope that she'll be able to respond in real time to your questions at the end. But depending on circumstances, depending on how things go that are completely out of her control, she might actually have to respond to your questions via email. And if that happens, we'll put that in the chat. So to present this paper, Dr. June Dickie has worked in Bible translation and scripture engagement since 1990. After completing the translation with the Mwane team in northern Mozambique in 2013, June served as a consultant in Nigeria and various other countries. In 2017, she completed a PhD in biblical studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where she worked with Zulu youth to help them learn to translate Psalms into their own language using the form of typical Zulu praise poetry. She completed her postdoctoral work in Psalms of Lament, which took her into trauma studies. She now works with various communities in translating and using the Psalms, performing biblical texts, and the important work of trauma healing. She has written extensively on these intersections of trauma, translation, and using the Bible in creative and ironic ways. And I'm looking forward to what she has to share with us today. So with that, I will see if I can share this. Okay, and
good morning, everybody. I'm recording this. I'm in South Africa at the moment, a beautiful sunny day, but on the day of our conference, I expect to be in the US, and I'm not sure how my connectivity will be. So I hope this will work. I'm going to try and share my screen. Right, so we begin. Our topic is trauma and use of the Bible, healing through performance. And I'll be looking at the story of Ruth and some Psalms of Lament to see how these biblical texts can help young people and adults experience a certain level of healing when they've been through difficult circumstances. The theoretical basis, first we'll look at literary trauma theory, then at Judith Herman's 3 steps towards trauma healing, then pastoral theology's response to soul abuse, lament theory, and biological healing through creative activity. First, literary trauma theory. This is a wonderful opportunity for those of us that work in biblical texts to realize that texts actually encode trauma and witness to trauma. And they do so using symbols, using linguistic symbols, which make the trauma at a distance in a safer place. And this facilitates a person to experience recovery and resilience. They can revisit the trauma, but in a controlled environment, sometimes through identifying with the emotions and the problems and the solutions that people in the text experience, or it may be through themselves using the text in some way to compose their own prayer or some form of story that enables them to be an agent, which is one of the main things in trauma healing. It enables the traumatic memories to be revisited safely at a distance. And some of the biblical texts that we've used that have been very successful have been Ruth, a nice short story, lots of dialogue, wonderful for performance, and it includes many traumatic experiences with which people can identify. Then the story of Job, his laments. My colleague Gerald West has used this in terms of helping HIV sufferers lament to God, to realize they don't always have to be saying, blessed be the God, he gives, he takes away. But there's another part to Job. The rape of Tamar has been extensively used, again by Gerald West and the Contextual Bible Study Group in South Africa, and lament psalms. I've done a lot of work with lament psalms, for example, Psalm 13, Psalm 3, and I'll go through some of that. First, most of us that work in trauma healing find ourselves using Judith Herman's 1992 book. She establishes 3 steps which are really important. First, the person must feel safe. The person who has been victimized, who has been acted upon, must know now that they are safe, emotionally, safe physically. Secondly, the trauma story must be reconstructed. This means that those triggers that brought about the trauma need to be revisited. And a lot of people think you must never set off those triggers. But the point is, if you don't revisit the story and the associated emotions, the person is not able to gain dominance over it. So that's very important. And part of that is just helping the person to tell the story from their perspective, to be an agent. And thirdly, because trauma is so isolating, it's very important that someone who's been victimized or abused is able to reconnect with the community. Aspects of pastoral theology in dealing with soul abuse. Abuse is identified by collapse of the self. Abuse is signified by collapse of the self. The person experiences fear or shame, despair. There's a loss of a She's done a lot of work in this area. She talks about the need for new liturgies, which include sacramental actions, not just words, but also actions, but sacramental, done in a set apart time and place that is sacred. Attention must be given to the person's sense of shame and their need for justice. A person who's been abused can't really make progress unless they know that the person who abused them will receive justice. Maybe not even in this life, but they can hand over justice to God and know that in the end, justice will be done. And that enables them to then be able to forgive and move on. And Emily Leon also talks about the importance of providing an opportunity for a transformative spiritual experience. We're not just dealing on the human level. We're inviting God to come in and do something that only God can do, that humans are not able to touch. A deep healing. And then I just refer as well here to some work that Zogbo and I did recently last year in Ivory Coast with some women. I'll explain a little bit about it, but we used poetry and rhythm, song, movement, dance, drama to promote social healing amongst the community, emotional healing within the person, and spiritual healing in their relationship with God. Lament theory is something that I've worked a lot in and found it to be very, very helpful in this world where there are so many things to lament about. How do we understand lament? Lament has certain features. First, it's addressed to God. It's not just ranting and raving to your neighbor, your friend, your mother. It's addressed to God, and that changes everything. It becomes a prayer. It invites God to act in the situation. Secondly, lament includes complaint. It's not just a request. The person has some deep negative emotion. It might be anger, fear, confusion, frustration. They might have a complaint against God or against enemies. We see both in the Psalms. For soul healing, the Psalms must be read as performance literature. The Psalms, of course, were composed to be spoken or sung, to be performed, not just to be read with the eyes. And we need to give attention to the different voices, the intonation patterns, the emotion underlying the text. The time and place should be sacred and safe. And if we're doing a communal lament, it should be done in public so that the audience can affirm the prayer of those who are praying and also hear their hurts and their pain in order to empathize and support. Lament can be expressed through words or through actions, ritualistic actions. I think I will go through one of those. Now, one of the things that for me is incredibly exciting is that creative activities like performance, like lament, drama, song, can actually result in biological healing. Yes, they can result in social healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing, but also biological healing. And this is the work of various neuropsychiatrists, psychologists, who understood the whole trauma pattern. When there's trauma, there's an overstimulation of certain hormones, which causes the amygdala, which is part of the brain, to malfunction. That in turn blocks the functioning of the hippocampus, which is another part of the brain. The hippocampus is not able to do what it normally does. It normally takes raw emotions, memories, and converts them into past history and stores them in the long-term memory. But because the function of the hippocampus is interrupted, these memories are left as raw, toxic, unprocessed emotions and fragments that can invade consciousness at any time, whenever the trigger goes. They can be very disturbing, these flashbacks, remembering the sound, hearing that sound again as if it's happening right now. The thing is that memory has not been put into past history, and so it's experienced as if it's happening right now. Of course, this is what happens in post-traumatic stress. People who've been through a war can hear a car backfires and it sounds to them like a bomb going off, and in their bodies react as if they're experiencing again that traumatic experience. It's lying there as a war memory, unprocessed. But the good news, and we have various researchers, Cozzolino is one of them, who refers to the plasticity of the brain, the fact that neurons are able to replicate and to regrow, and those neurons which were destroyed during trauma can be replaced. And then the memories can be processed properly. Now, what kind of situation promotes this replacement of the damaged neurons? The fabulous work that's been done shows that it's moderate levels of stress or stimulation, as when a person's learning something new, in a positive interpersonal environment. So those two things are needed for neuron replacement to happen, for the triggers for these neurons to be replaced. Moderate levels, not too much stress and not too much stimulation, but as in learning something new, doing a poem, performing, interacting with others, writing one's own poem, one's own Lamem prayer. These are all providing moderate stimulation. And if it's done in a positive interpersonal environment, we can expect that there will be biological healing as well. Okay, applying this theory. So research indicates these four things are important. A sufferer, someone who's been through trauma, firstly must become an agent and tell her story in a safe context. Instead of being acted upon as a victim, she becomes an agent. She does the action. She determines how the story will be told, what's important. She's in charge. Secondly, the person needs to build relationships with others to break that isolation that's so negative in trauma. Thirdly, have a sense of justice. Federico Villanueva talks about this in his work on Psalms, Lament Psalms. And the wonderful thing is that in Lament Psalms, we have a way to hand over issues of justice to God. I think that's the main point of Lament Psalms myself. It enables us to have a sense of justice restored so that we can forgive sometimes ourselves, forgive the enemy, maybe forgive God, and move on. And then fourthly, experience God. As Emily Leon said, we want it to be a transformative spiritual experience that the person has. We need to invite God to come in. We need to provide space for there to be a spiritual interaction. So the first example I'll go through is performing the story of Naomi and Ruth. And I'm really keen on using performance in all sorts of ways for trauma healing, for exegesis, for scripture engagement. But here it's for trauma healing. And the wonderful thing is performance requires one to consider the emotions of the characters. It goes beneath the text. It goes beneath the storyline. How is the person feeling here? Which provides opportunity for the actors and the audience to resonate, to identify on an emotional level with what's happening in the story. The way we did it with the story of Ruth, we had 5 actors on stage. We had Ruth and Naomi, Boaz, a narrator, and then we had a jester. And the jester interrupted the narrative at pertinent points to ask the audience various questions, to provoke discussion, and to provide opportunity for both audience and actors to explore the issues behind the traumatic events. For example,
go with her. Go find yourself a husband.
No, I don't want to go. I want to go where you go. I want to live where you live.
I want to serve your God is my God. Will you die? I die.
Right, so you saw there a little excerpt of Naomi and Ruth, with Ruth making her wonderful commitment to her mother-in-law. And I was mentioning about how the jester would then interrupt and ask a question. So at this point in the text, the jester might ask this question: how do you think Ruth felt when her mother-in-law showed no positive response to her heartfelt commitment to her? You know, the biblical text has a gap here. There's no indication of whether Naomi is happy that her daughter-in-law is coming with her, will be a young person to help her. Or is she irritated that now she's got another person she's going to have to be responsible for? She's taking this foreign woman into her own country. Is she going to have to try and help this person settle in? On stage, the performer playing that role has to show some emotion. They have to either indicate they're happy or they're bored or they're indifferent, either give her a hug or show on the face that she's irritated. So it's interesting how the actors interpret it, but it's also of value to ask the audience, how would you feel in a situation like that? And it raises the whole matter of the in-law relationship, which is fraught with problems in most societies. And in African society, it's a big difficulty. There's such deference that has to be shown to the mother-in-law, but often the frustration is felt by the daughter-in-law, and these audience members are aware of that, and sometimes it's a trauma they've been through. So it's helpful to open up the discussion and for them to be able to talk about it. In the actual, while the play is going on, while the drama is happening, there might not be opportunity to explore the topic in great detail, but it opens the issue. And then later, when there is time, one can go back and explore it further. Here are the grade 6 learners. The cast on the left is when they did it before a school audience. And then we did the same show with slightly different cast before a church audience. It was very interesting to see the difference. The church audience included, of course, adults and people of a different racial background. And for some of them, it was very threatening. The young man there who played the part of Boaz, he was very nervous about presenting, about acting in front of the church community. He didn't know the people, they were adults. And my friend who went to pick him up to give him a ride to the church event said to him, listen, don't worry. If you're feeling nervous, just look at me and I'll be cheering you on. And afterwards, he came to her and he said, it was absolutely wonderful. Maybe I'm going to become an actor. And for me, what was so exciting is that this young boy was actually repeating his grade. He had failed, but now he had found a measure of achievement in something else. He was the only boy in the cast, the only boy who persevered through the 6 months of practices. And he had a new self-respect, self-confidence. Wonderful. This is the adult group. It was members of a Bible study in one of the townships. And we acted it out in somebody's home, a very confined space. And the audience actually included a baby. So we borrowed the baby when we got to that part. It was a lot of fun. The casts, they all enjoyed it. It gave them self-confidence. They had fun, sense of camaraderie. This next one is what we did last year, the story of Ruth through song and drama in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast has been through 2 periods of war in the last few decades, and many of the women are still trying to get through the traumas of bereavement, losing their sons, losing their husbands, facing widowhood, especially now as older women. They remember what it was like to be hungry during the war years, being displaced. And many of them still feel very vulnerable without a man in their lives. One of the great opportunities that we wanted to capitalize on was the Bete community's love of song and of drama. And so we decided to study the biblical text of Ruth, because they could identify with so many of the traumas, and to express it and to invite the ladies to express the story through performance, either through drama or through song. Okay, before we go on with the next slide, I just want to share a few things about those two videos. The first one, I thought you would enjoy seeing the Bet women singing. It's different and it might not be what you're used to, but the local people absolutely loved it. You might have noticed the audience members, within a few minutes, they were all on their feet and going, "Ayo, ayo," as their way of saying, yes, yes, yes. And the pastor actually said to us, heaven came down. The depth of the meaning of the words and the sense of the presence of the Spirit that came through those songs was just so amazing. So the songs was a very deep spiritual experience for the women. It was something they identified with. They would sing along and they could express themselves. The drama, on the other hand, as you noticed, was very entertaining, comical, over the top. At first, we were a little bit worried. We thought, oh dear, we've completely mismatched the genres here. The drama was meant to make them think about serious issues. But in retrospect, we realized that the two genres actually complemented one another perfectly. The lightness and the amusement of the drama served as light relief between the heavier, more emotionally and spiritually stirring times. And also, just by engaging with the drama, they heard the story again and again. There was the repetition that helped them to remember it and to engage with the details. So it actually worked very well. And as you saw there, the death of, that was Elimelech, the first person to die in the story, totally over the top emotion showed. And that seems to be what's expected in many African societies. And the ladies, as we talked about it, we talked about how Christians respond to death and how the local community would respond using their cultural forms. They all jumped up and started singing and dancing something called the stick dance, which is something that they do at the time of a death. And apparently the Christians won't do it. There's some symbolism and perhaps contact with other things that they feel is not correct. But it was just a great opportunity to explore how they understand death, how they respond to death, how they mourn, and to try and bring that into their expression of what Ruth and what Naomi went through. Okay, so let's carry on now with the next part, which is about lament, helping people use the biblical Psalms of lament to compose their own laments. And this was one of the groups I worked with, and they're doing their performance here. This is another group. This is a group of HIV positive women. And the lovely thing was they've all been through the same thing. And so once we had studied lament, we would study Psalm 3, Psalm 13, understand the different elements of a lament that we talked about, the address to God, complaint, request for justice, and also an affirmation of faith. I'll go through an example just now, and you'll see that that's almost always in the biblical laments. But as they had seen that that's the pattern of laments and they composed their own laments, they then together composed a communal lament. They've all been struck with HIV now because of being abused. And yet as a group together, that you can see the joy in their faces as they bring their pain, as they bring their fears in prayer, and then they made a chorus. Lord, we're crying out to you. Lord, we're crying out to you. Right, some of the values, some of the benefits of using the form of biblical laments. The participants recognize that all emotion is acceptable. This is a big thing. You know, many people think that we always have to be positive and praising and thanking God. And they don't know what to do with negative emotion. But as we read the Psalms, we realize that before God, all emotion is acceptable. There's no holds barred. Anger, frustration, confusion, fear. We don't have to pretend with God. We can bring it. One of the Psalms says, pour out your heart before God. Pour out your heart. Let it all just flow. God welcomes all of our emotions, and he views lament as an act of faith. The very fact that we are bringing those deepest things in our hearts to God means we are trusting him. We are believing that God can do something. The great thing of biblical laments is it gives space for God to speak. And as we study the biblical laments, we see that it is actually a dialogue. God speaks back. Sometimes you have to read under the lines, between the lines, but God's voice is apparent. When we consider the sudden change of mood, Psalm 2, Lord, these enemies are saying, God will never help you. Verse 2. And then verse 3, Lord, you are my shield. You are my glory and the lifter of my head. Something's happened there. Something's happened between verse 2 and verse 3. God has spoken. The psalmist has been reminded of something or has heard something that's changed his mood. So laments are dialogues. All of the psalms are dialogues. We need to see the different voices speaking. One of the values of writing one's own biblical laments is it enables one to be more real, to experience greater spiritual authenticity, to realize we don't have to perform before God. We don't have to pretend all's fine and hallelujah when I'm actually crying inside. There's a place to be real. Spiritual authenticity is when what we experience of God and what we believe about God are in alignment. And they're not always. And when they're not in alignment, we need to lament. We need to bring this to God and express what's worrying us. And then lastly, as people hand over justice to God, they're free to forgive and to move forward in their lives. Okay, here's an example, Psalm 3. Let's just go through it fairly quickly. Verse 1, O Lord, Yahweh. So straight away we realize that this person is speaking to God. It's a biblical lament. It's not just ranting and raving. And then verses 1 and 2, the light blue, he's complaining. How many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God. God will never help him. his complaint. And then notice from verse 3 to 6, first it starts with a but, indicating the sudden change of mood. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and I slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Okay, so what we see here is an affirmation, confidence in the Lord, an affirmation of trust, something the psalmist knows about God that gives him confidence that God will respond to his request for help. And then in verse 7, we have the requests. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Two imperatives, asking God to do something. And then the second part of verse 7, notice the appeal for justice, or the affirmation, the acknowledgement that God will give justice. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. When we act this out, I always get the enemies to start complaining about their mouths, not being able to speak anymore. The psalmist asked God to punish these enemies in a way that matches the crime. They were speaking evil of him. So he says, God, sort them out so they can't carry on speaking evil of me. It's a great release to people when they realize that we can ask God for justice. And you'll see just now in a prayer of one of the refugees, how she asked God to do this. And then the psalm ends with an affirmation. Salvation belongs to the Lord, a declaration to the community, and then a request for God to bless all the people, not just himself. He's been blessed. God has taken care of his need. And now he's extending a prayer for blessing on all the people. So we see there the different parts of a lament psalm, an address to the God, a complaint, affirmation of faith, and request for help and for justice. To help people compose their own laments, I'll give them these questions one at a time. Just read it out and ask them to write down. First, what worry or frustration or difficulty are you dealing with right now that seems unjust to you? What do you have that emotional angst about? So that's trying to get at the complaint. Secondly, what one big thing would you like God to do for you? Try to focus on the big issues. What's the big request? If God or Jesus came and sat down in the chair next to you and said, right, tell me, we've got 20 minutes. What do you want me to do for you? What would you ask? Thirdly, what would you like God to do to those who caused you pain? How will you feel that a sense of justice has been established? What needs to happen for you to be satisfied that there's justice and you can move on? You don't have to carry on holding that burden of revenge. And fourth, what do you know about God that gives you confidence that God might act in your situation? This is looking for those affirmations of faith. What do you know? What do you remember about God, his character? What do you remember about what God's done in your life in the past, which gives you hope that he might act again in this situation? So here we just have a few photos of some youngsters bringing their pain to God. They wrote words which they held up. Why is there so much hate and violence? Why, God, you take people who we love? Rhetorical questions, complaints. Sometimes we can't even express it. It feels too I can't say that to God, but these folks wrote it down to get it out. This is a lament of a woman from Zimbabwe who was in a support group. She says, Lord, actually, sorry, this is a Zulu woman. Lord, till when will I suffer? For how long will people play me? They make me like a car that won't start, a useless one. Till when? Every time I try to put things together, life is not coming together. And you're there just looking. Didn't they say that you listen when you called? But you're taking long to answer. But till when, my Lord? Me leaving my poverty? Others do get help, but me, I'm not. I know, my Lord, I have to wait, but it's hard. I'll stay in the hope, and you are my lights. So we see a lot of complaint. All of the light blue is her complaint, and the purple at the end, affirmation. You are my lights. I'll stay in the hope. You give me hope. There's no actual request, although we could see in line 6, others get help, but me not. Maybe she's saying, Lord, help me. Maybe it is a request, a veiled request. But you can see how this lady has taken the form of a biblical lament to compose her own laments. She's used fantastic imagery. This is an uneducated woman, a woman who was abused as a young teenager. She's now in this HIV support group. She hasn't had a chance to study, but look at her wonderful use of language. This, of course, is a translation from the Sisulu, but she says, how long will people play me? I feel like I'm being played, I'm being used like a car, but now I'm a useless car. Wonderful imagery. When you go around the African communities, you see all sorts of cars lying around that are no use. She says, that's what I am. I've been used and abused. Yeah, it was just great to see these groups come together and work out a communal lament, to see the interaction, the support they give one another in the composition, in the performance, in their lives. Here the HIV positive women are preparing a lament, and now we're going to listen to it.
Kungani baba ufaba besifazane kanye nengane zethu. Kungani baba asithola imisebenzi sizama njalo lutho. Kungani baba abafana bebulalana bodwa bephelela ezidakamizweni. Kungani baba abesifazane baphelela emakhaya lutho imshado. Kungani baba izwe linje.
Okay, just to sum up now, the benefits of this approach to healing and hope, it's indirect. It avoids confrontation. It's not invasive nor introspective. A person can share as much as they want to. As they listen to the story of Ruth and Naomi, they can find that which resonates with them. If they wish to share it, they can. In Ivory Coast at the end, when we had people giving feedback, the one lady said, I am Naomi. That's exactly what happened to me. Others said, I came here feeling hopeless, but I've seen how God can work together difficult circumstances to make a way. He did that for Ruth. Maybe he can do it for me. So people can respond according to where they're at. The Lord can work with them without us confronting them and saying, what about this? And what do you feel about that? It's creative. It's fun. It builds group connections and confidence. There's a focus on emotional resonance. I feel that this is one of the main advantages rather than content. Some approaches to trauma healing tend to be a bit didactic. You'll have a story and then the people are asked to repeat the story, to tell it again. But sometimes the content is more in focus than actually the emotions and identifying. People are trying to find the right answers and trying to see themselves. And I think that's where performance can be so helpful. In performance, people enter into the experience of the characters. They understand the kind of situations that Ruth faced. How would she feel having to go down to the threshing floor at night and meet with her boss? And when the jester opens up the question to the audience, they can hear what other people think. When we did this, the little boys said, oh, she'd be excited. And when the jester asked the girls, what do you think? They said, no, we'd be really frightened. So there's an emotional connection with the story that comes when it's done through performance and through participation. Everybody's involved. It's not listening to someone else telling the story, but it's getting involved and telling the story yourself through song or drama. And lastly, it's inexpensive. It uses a simple methodology. I'm not a drama expert. I can hardly sing in tune as well. But by bringing the biblical text, helping people explore the text, get into the text, feel the emotions of the people, it can bring healing, it can bring hope, and all of us can do it by God's grace. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that, June. And I can see that you, I think, are available to take some questions. I think we'll start it off with Valerie had a great question. I don't know, Valerie, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question to June.
I'd be happy to. Thank you for such a moving talk. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. What advice would you offer to those working in cultures who've lost the practice of lament, who feel uncomfortable with lament?
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. That's a really key question. There's not too much around noise. I'm here in a cafe. You know, most communities nowadays, especially in the West, are very uncomfortable with lament. And I think we just need to return to the Psalms of Lament. You know, there are more Psalms of Lament than there are Psalms of Praise. And yet we tend to pick the Psalms we read. And I found just by exposing people, you know, most people when they're going through huge pain, they will look for Psalms of Lament. I was chatting to a friend in our church and I said, which of you have found help in Psalms of Lament? And he said when his wife was going through cancer treatment, he just stuck on one psalm and went over and over and over it again. And Psalm 88, the most difficult psalm, the darkest psalm, is the one that speaks to people when they're in their deepest need. You know, it's what spoke to the Jewish community when they try to make sense of the Holocaust, what helps people when they're dealing with chronic illness. And so I think just for us to realize we can be real, let's be authentic. I did Psalms of Lament in the Cape Coloured community where there's very much a atmosphere or an attitude that we must always be thanking and praising and victory and we're the head and not the tail. And as they began to realize that it actually takes faith to trust God with our pain and not to feel we've got to constantly be impressing him, they were set free. And I actually did measurements and found that their spiritual authenticity increased. They began to become more comfortable with a God who understood them when they were going through hard times. So I think we just have to talk about it. You know, it's becoming much more common in the church nowadays. And those of us that have seen the light, we need to just try and spread it as much as we can. But thank you. Good question. There's Laura's given a question about cultures that are shrouded in shame when things about performance art, the fool of myself, it does free up other people. And youngsters, I find youngsters are generally much more open to make a little bit of a fool of themselves. And, you know, young teenagers, I've worked with youth groups and get them to do a performance before the adult church community. It's small things, but, you know, people can write their own personal laments in private. It doesn't have to be exposed. And we did this, and then we took all their prayers and together offered them to God in a liturgical, in a sacrament. So we don't want it to just be something that's seen as outside of worship. Lament is part of worship. And people need to recognize just as praise is part of worship, so is lament. Any other questions? There's one last one here.
Yes.
I'm interested in the point that lament is addressed to God and is done in public. Yeah, it can be done in public, but also in private. Communal lament should be done in public. And by communal lament, I mean when a community is together bringing their pain, for example, refugees or, you know, like the HIV positive women who've been through something that the rest of the church community needs to understand. Then we need to hear their pain. So the audience is needed in order to acknowledge and affirm their pain and stand together with them. But in private, most of my lamenting is in private, just as well. Anything else? Did I catch
I had a
everything?
question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I had a question come to me in the chat, which was, you know, is there an optimal time after trauma or before too long for this sort of trauma healing process that's, you know, that would be appropriate?
You know, the first thing after trauma is for a person to be able to address the trauma, to speak about it, and that might take time before they can use words, but they might be able to represent it through miming or through art. I don't know that there's an optimal time. I think that poison needs to come out, that pain needs to come out, and even if it's just little by little, find somebody that's, we need to, if we're not going through trauma ourselves, we need to become the ears that give people space to be able to talk. There's a whole lot here at the end, something about, do you find there are changes of interpretation of the performers during the preparation in their own or during rehearsal? Changes of interpretation. The interesting thing is that sometimes people in pain bring a different interpretation to a text. I'll take Psalm 134 as an example. Those who stand by night in the house of the Lord. Come bless the Lord, you who stand by night in the house of the Lord. It seems like a simple praise psalm, but when some guys who were going through great difficulty, their church had just, there'd been huge fraud and their Bible school had been closed, both of them interpreted that to mean those who persevere through difficulty. So they took stand as persevere and night as difficulty. So often a person's interpretation depends on where they're at, the trauma they're experiencing. There's lots of room for all of you guys to come and speak into all these questions because there's so much work to be done. This is just the beginning.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I think I've gone over time, haven't I?
Yeah, I think that we started started a bit late, so it's totally fine. I really appreciate everything that you said. I think you really highlighted you know, the value of biblical lament and the value of emotions, and you know, how getting into a text, you know, performing its dramatic moves might be both illuminating to, you know, interpretation of the biblical text, but also facilitate the much needed trauma healing process. So I really appreciate that. I know that you have to go and I think catch a bus for another conference and talk. So you're in high demand. So we're just so thankful that you were able to grace us with your presence and your very life-giving and illuminating presentation. So if we want to give it up for June.
Thanks, Brandon, and I hope you have a great conference, and I'll be listening in on the recordings. Thanks so much. Blessings to you all.
Thank you, June.
Great.
All right. Well, we're going to take a 3.5 minute comfort break. I think that is plenty of time. So make tea, do what you need to do. We'll be back at 8:05 in England, at least 8:05. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, I gave you an extra minute, so hopefully everyone's back, and if not, maybe the sound of my voice will lure people back. So continuing right along, our second presentation of the evening comes from Professor Christopher Southgate, who is the Professor of Christian Theodicy at the University of Exeter. Originally trained as a biochemist, he has been exploring the interface between scientific issues and Christian theology since the early 1990s. From 2017 through 2021, he directed a project on healthy ministry in the face of sudden disasters, and he is a co-editor of Tragedies and Christian Congregations, published by Routledge in 2020. During the pandemic, the project delivered over 100 courses on trauma-informed ministry. Christopher's other books include The Groaning of Creation and A Theology in a Suffering World, Glory and Longing. Chris is also the author of 8 collections of poetry, and the most recent being Rain Falling by the River. And yes, that's right, he's a scientist, a theologian, and a poet. And the title of his talk this evening is creatively called The Trauma and the Bible. And with that, we will hand that over to you, Christopher.
Thanks very much indeed, Brandon, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you and hope these reflections will be of use. Like June, whose talk I thought was so marvelous, I'm also concerned with the use of the Bible in recovery after traumatizing events, thinking more perhaps about communities rather than necessarily specifically the healing of the individual. Let me see if I can share my screen here. How's that? Is it all visible to you? Wonderful. So as Brandon was saying, I became interested in this area back in 2016 out of a range of things, really. I found myself in conversation with a friend who worked in the States on the aftermath of terrible violence in communities, those shootings that are all too common in that society. And from an organization called the Institute for Collective Trauma and Growth, she sent teams into churches to help them with ministry after that kind of terrible shock events. And then we had our own share in the UK and Europe in that summer of terrorist attacks, again with very shocking impact of violence on communities. And I also happened to be reading Shelley Rambo's book, Spirit and Trauma, in which she says some remarkable things. The language of resurrection is in many senses the language of the oppressor. Resurrection not guaranteed, but this life that must be witnessed into being. Well, that was very different from the kind of theology that I'd grown up on. And it made me think that trauma poses additional theological challenges that need to be explored. So I gathered together this project really around the question, what does good Christian ministry look like after the unthinkable has happened? And I worked especially with my former colleagues, Hilary Eisen and Carla Grosch Miller. And then we had funding for a postdoc and were very fortunate to hire Megan Warner, who's now at the URC Northern College in Manchester. So I want to begin by saying a little bit about what Meg taught us about the relation of the Bible to trauma. So this first set of observations really comes from her. Oh, that's interesting. That is there we are. So one thing that Meg points out in her work is that a large proportion of our biblical texts were either written or reached their final form in the context of trauma, whether that be the fall of the Northern Kingdom, or more particularly the fall of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon. And of course, the New Testament is also shot through with reflection on the passion of Christ and the sufferings of Christians. So trauma is the context for so much of the formation of our scriptures. And Meg goes on to say that something very remarkable happened after the fall of Jerusalem. That instead of abandoning their Jerusalem-centered tribal gods, the Israelites found themselves claiming that God's glory could also be glimpsed in Babylon, in the vision of Ezekiel. And in the thought of second Isaiah, they expanded their understanding of their God to cosmic proportions. God is the author of weal and woe alike, Isaiah 45:7. Very interesting text, by the way, in the study of the Bible and violence. Now, one I'm especially interested in relation to natural disasters, but that's a whole nother issue. They saw their God as the cosmic God, the author of weal and woe alike, that it was their God Yahweh who had sent the Persian king to release them from Babylon. Besides Yahweh, there is no other. This radical transcendent monotheism is born astonishingly out of the defeat and disgrace of the people. Oh, this is interesting. One of the most remarkable books I've read in recent years on trauma is this book, Proverbs of Ashes, a very challenging but important book. And I love this quotation from Rebecca Ann Parker. I did not defeat negative feelings of anguish and despair because I saw something more lovely and good. Rather, I became able to feel more. My feeling broadened. Pain, sadness, and despair were not eliminated or overcome. I embraced them with a larger heart. And there's a sense in which that's what the biblical writers are able to do after the fall of Jerusalem and the exile. What has happened, but they're able to embrace it with a larger heart. So what Meg would say is that our scriptures are robust texts to perform in the face of disaster, just because they themselves emerge out of places of defeat and suffering. But of course, there are very many ways to use the Bible, many ways in which we combine our own experience of life with the plurivocal account that the scriptures give us of God's ways with the world. And when our experience is of traumatizing situations, then the question of how we turn to the Bible and how we relate our shattered, fragmented story to the narratives within the scriptures becomes all the more pressing. I'm going to run through. Oh. Another very important book in the study of trauma is Ronnie Yanoff Pullman's Shattered Assumptions. And her hypothesis is that there are implicit assumptions by which humans tend to live, things that we don't even articulate, but which we assume in order to be able to get up in the morning. That the world is basically a consistent place, that people are not necessarily out to get us, that goodness is ultimately rewarded, and that children should and generally do have the chance to grow up, and that individuals are of worth. Well, those are, even as I say them, I recognize how fragile those assumptions are in so many parts of the world. But I think in the privileged parts of the first world, those assumptions are very deeply embedded, and therefore when something shocking happens, then those assumptions are shattered with very painful and troubling results. And what the community has to do over time is to reassemble the story they live by in a way that accommodates those the fact that those assumptions were shattered in the past. So COVID provides us with a kind of example of that. In that we recognize the natural world was no longer reliable. places and spaces were not safe as they had been, and goodness was not necessarily rewarded, because many of the early casualties were in the healthcare sector, those who were seeking to help us. One very strong response, of course, in the early days of the pandemic, and still now in a measure, was a desperate hunger to return to normality, for the vaccines and the antivirals to make the natural world reliable again. Brandon, in his introduction, was mentioning all these Zoom courses that that we did with clergy groups at that time, and it was very striking. I would ask them what their sources of hope were, and I expected, I must say I expected some more overtly theological and indeed biblical answers. But what people told me by and large was their hope lay in the vaccine working. They wanted the physical normality to return through the virus being held at bay in that way. I'm going to come back to the theme of hope a bit later. But I want to explore some more about these implicit narratives by which communities live. I've always been much influenced by this seminal book that James Hopewell wrote in the early 1980s, a most remarkable book about the internal narratives that congregations and communities live by. And one interesting thing about the onset of the pandemic was the way in which certain sorts of stories and certain sorts of appeal to scripture proved to be disastrous. So in certain types of congregations in the Bible Belt, there was a conviction that the spirit-filled Christian need have nothing to fear from the virus, because the authentic believer would be preserved supernaturally from harm. And sadly, as you'll realize, that didn't quite play out, and many church members and indeed pastors died as a result of that type of conviction. So that was an example of a failed story, what Hopewell would call an over-charismatic story that didn't play itself out appropriately in the new situation. And another type of narrative that seems to me to be problematic is what might be called an over-realized comic genre of story, that one that insists through its liturgy, its hymns, its preaching, that after the resurrection we're already in God's happy ending, where no earthly struggles really signify. That's precisely the sort of spirituality that Rambo criticizes so severely as being positively oppressive to those who are in the midst of trauma. June touched on that very interestingly, I thought, when she talked about churches needing to recognize that we don't always need to be praising, that there is space for the authenticity of lament as well. But a very interesting type of story to which I want to give some attention now is what Hopewell would call an ironic story. And that's an implicit narrative of the world, which is so purged of hope of redemption that it actually lives rather in the contours of the book of Ecclesiastes. Human life knows cycles, times to weep and times to laugh, times to mourn and times to dance. We all lose our breath and die, humans and animals alike. To seek a more directional meta-narrative, to identify any trajectory towards salvation or hope out of those cycles, is vanity. Or as Matthew Arnold put it in the ending of Dover Beach, the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Those words are from 1867, but they have a chilling aptness today, I think. A genre of congregational story lacking in supernatural hope is identified by Hopewell as ironic. And this is the genre brilliantly evoked by authors like Beckett and Kafka. As Hopewell characterizes this genre, miracles do not happen, patterns lose their design, life is unjust, not justified by transcendent forces. God-o never comes, no system of justice ever emerges in the trial. Hopes placed in leaders in the end disappoint. So this ironic mode is religion from which hope of God's redemptive initiatives has been stripped away. It serves as an important antidote to the sort of magical Christianity in which God finds believers their every last parking space. And for that reason alone, it's important that Ecclesiastes continues to be read and preached. But I have a theory that Christianity practiced without hope of redemption, personal or cosmic, is much more common than church leaders might be willing to admit. It's resilient to disappointment, and that must be very attractive in the face of this turbulent world and as the repercussions of the pandemic stretch out. I wonder whether this sort of rhythmic spirituality, which doesn't really hope for anything except the continuation of the inevitable cycles of life, is not a particular temptation for places that pride themselves on their rhythm of life, places that see themselves as in it for the long haul. But it doesn't seem to me that such a spirituality is faithful to that great longing in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Hope, expressed privately and publicly as that great yearning for a Godward reorientation of the world, is, it seems to me, an inescapable part of a whole Christian faith. So I'm going to come back shortly to that question of where is hope to be found. But before I do that, I just want to touch on the book of Job, which June mentioned as one of her sources for that splendid work that she's doing. Of course, Job is the classic locus of the scriptures' struggle with suffering. And if Job ended at the end of chapter 41, after all his protestations had been met by the towering transcendent God of the speeches from the whirlwind, then those speeches apparently mock God's smallness and lack of understanding, then perhaps we would be back in the land of ironic narrative, where no individual human struggle is really of any account. But strikingly, Job is vindicated in chapter 42. And in a remarkable book I've just been reading called Abraham's Silence, Richard Middleton has a fascinating analysis of the book of Job. And so what he wants to say, and I'm sure he's right about this, is that Job is not a work of theodicy. Rather, it is a thought experiment in what counts as appropriate speech towards God in time of great suffering. So Middleton goes through the phases of Job's speaking throughout the book. And you might remember at the beginning, he says so famously, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So he begins with that conventional pious affirmation of blessing. But after his second course of disasters, as it were, then he moves on to a place which is acceptance rather than blessing. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? And then as his struggle and suffering deepens, then he famously curses the day that he was born, and we get a kind of anti-creation poem. Let the stars of its dawn, that's the day of his birth, be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none. So he deepens and deepens his protest at the ways of God, and then of course famously he rejects serially and over a great number of verses the various theodicies that are offered by the friends. Finally, God speaks to him, and Job replies first with an admission of his insignificance. See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and I will not answer, twice but will proceed no further. And Job is then silent. And finally, at the very enigmatic and fascinating turn of the book in 42, Job responds to the divine speech by saying, 42:6, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And it's a very, very difficult verse to translate, but the question Middleton is posing is, what is Job repenting of? And his answer, rightly or wrongly, is Job is not repenting of all that protest that occupied the bulk of the book, which ultimately the Lord seems to affirm when the Lord finally speaks again and affirms Job's ways at the expense of the friends. Middleton says that what Job repents of is that he was finally silenced in his encounter with God. And so Middleton's suggesting that this is the kind of ultimate vindication of the prayer of protest and lament. That lament is, as June was saying, the most profound act of faith, in a sense, and that we have that encapsulated in this extraordinary book of Job. So I'm hopping about in this talk, And I just hope to strike some sparks in you and look forward very much to our discussion of them. So I'm going to offer you 3 thoughts about how a community in the process of recovery from a time of disaster of whatever kind, be it violent or not, what might be healthy ways forward. And the first of them, I suggest, is and this is a mark of the health of a recovery community, where it's able to say, what has happened has happened. It's not the whole of reality, but that we seek to face up to the fact of what has happened and not to escape from it. And that perception always reminds me of the great line of T.S. Eliot's, "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." And it seems to me that our constant task as ministers, as Christians, is to seek to bear reality to the full and help others to bear it, not to be evading it or disappearing from it into various forms of avoidance and escapism, but to face up to the world as it really is, and recognize it also as God's world. And that's partly involves performing, to go back to June's word, performing the scriptures to the full, including the parts which are not, which are conveniently omitted from lectionaries and from churches' rhythms of reading, including those most uncomfortable bits of the Bible, Lamentations, Job, Ecclesiastes, and indeed the lament Psalms. And not only to make sure that those texts are read, but to make sure that they are preached on as well, so that those trauma-informed narratives and prayers that the scriptures offer us are able to help to frame our own stories and lives of prayer. And my third suggestion, which I call 3-lensed seeing, is that as the immediate impact of disasters recedes and we're able to reflect on them, that it's helpful to reflect on them through 3 types of lens which need to be applied simultaneously to the same event. The first is to see events in the light of the creation, in the light of the character of the world that God has made. This is particularly important in relation to natural disasters. These are not necessarily, outbreaks of evil, but they are the world as it unfolds, doing its thing. COVID virus is an example, but also to be able to see events that have caused great suffering in the light of Christ's cross. That in the light of our perception that there's no extent of suffering, no extent of agony, which is not also present to Christ through his experience of the passion, so that he is with us in every extremity of our suffering, and there's no event that separates us from him. And lastly, the recognition that that this is not the end of the story, but that the world is ultimately destined for a place where there will be no more crying. And it's vital, I hope you can see, to keep those lenses together, not simply to disappear into the third lens as an escape from the way things are, but not to disappear either into the first lens and to lose touch with hope. I'm going to, time is getting a bit short, so I'm not going to do as much of this last exercise as I was going to do, but I will touch on it briefly in the hope that, again, it might strike some reactions in you. So, a most astonishing part of the New Testament, it always seems to me, is this passage in 2 Corinthians 4. And in particular, those extraordinary verses 8 and 9, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. And for those of you who love the Greek, there's some very interesting verbal plays here. And there are some very interesting connections which I won't give you in any detail now, but I'll just refer you back to the part of chapter 1 where Paul is talking about the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. And yet, in that extremity of suffering, Paul was able to rely on what he calls the consolation that he receives through Christ. So he says, for just as the sufferings of Christ are abundant for us, so also our consolation is abundant through Christ. So, and that takes me to this extraordinary verse, verse 10, a real puzzle cube, if ever there was one, always carrying in the body the dying of Jesus. It's not actually, the death of Jesus is not quite right there. It's the dying of Jesus that the apostles carry in the body, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies, so that somehow or other this association with the dying of Jesus is to give light and life to others. And that's a very extraordinary claim, and I could say a whole lot more about it, but what I wanted to suggest to you is that what we see in the dying of Jesus is someone in whom, in the extremity of affliction, identity is not destroyed. That Jesus is always absolutely able to be himself, despite the extremity of his agony, and not merely that he retains his own identity, but he confers identity on others. He gives the thief an unexpected place in the new creation. He gives to his mother a son, and to his beloved the gift of the one closest to him. So that there's a sense in which Paul is saying that a deep association with the dying of Jesus and that retention of identity despite everything, despite the extremity of suffering, that can be strengthening for his group, and through that strengthening, it can be life-giving for others. So I've been working on the theme of glory, and in recent work I've proposed that divine glory is not about beauty or radiance, but whatever functions as a sign of the deep reality of God. And I suggest to you that the whole life of Jesus functions as such a sign. And the dying of Jesus and the strength and consolation it contains is a key part of that signification. So to carry the knowledge of that dying is a key part of our being signs of the great sign of God, that is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So when we're thinking about hope in relation to the passion of Christ, I think there are two components to that aspect of hope. The first is Christ's solidarity with all sufferers, as I was saying before. So no locus of suffering is beyond his experience or his consoling compassion. But also there's a sense that identification with that passion can strengthen us, protect us from despair and destruction, refine the sign that we come to be of the great sign of God, that is Christ. So survival of being handed over to death for Jesus' sake becomes a strength for others. And the apostles become clearer and more light-bearing signs of the reality of God's gift of the Christ, handed over for the life of the world. And so they become, and we are offered the chance to become, in the thought world of 2 Corinthians, transformed to a new and greater degree of glory. As I was saying, I've roamed far and wide hoping to strike some sort of sparks from some people, and I hope that in our remaining time we might be able to have some interesting conversation about one or other of these areas. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Southgate. I think, COVID, I think everyone experienced COVID a bit differently, but I think collectively we've all realized that it has shown us that the narratives, we live by and we make sense of our world are just so fragile in the face of trauma. And I think your talk really offered us a positive way forward. I'll open it up for any questions. If you want to either type them in the chat or raise your hand, I'll see if I can do my best to call on you. Yeah, I see a question from Sarah. Do you want to ask that question if you'd like to unmute yourself?
Sure. I'm just combining the two lectures in my mind through that verse 10 because, and I think this came up in several of the other comments about cultures that have lost the ability to lament. And if some of carrying that, the dying of Jesus around is being willing to be broken open to our own suffering and present to it, but also broken open to the suffering of others. And just to borrow that idea of a larger heart, there's a verse, and I can't pull it up in my memory now, about like that we might be strengthened to know his love. And I'm wondering if some of our need for strength in knowing his love is that suffering solidarity that you talked about, and that's part of that verse 10.
Absolutely. That's very well put, if I may say so. And so just to think a little more about identification with the Passion. I mean, one aspect of course, of it is the most intense and shocking of laments in the cry of desolation from the cross. And so to be able to identify with that, but also to see the profundity of the faith that lies behind that is not in any sense a rejection of God, but the determination to connect with God out of extremity. I think that's a very powerful spiritual resource. But another thing that I think that we can glean from that kind of contemplation is reflecting how Jesus is astonishingly always looking to other people and recognizing their pain and their need, even in the extent of his own. And maybe that's connecting with what you were saying. And
yes, and just that part of carrying our cross is being willing to have our hearts broken on behalf of others, the suffering of others.
Yeah. No, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, we have a question from Laura. Would you like to?
Yeah, I can ask that question. So I was just thinking about your particular aspects of hope in relation to the 2 Corinthians passage, and just wondering if one of the markers of trauma is often the fracturing of the self and a loss of identity. Is Jesus able to fully identify with the trauma survivor in solidarity if his identity is not shattered in some way? I was just wondering if you might be able to respond to that. Does Jesus have to fully enter into all of what the trauma survivor faces in order to, I don't know, have that hope in a way? Otherwise, does it feel a little bit surface level? Don't know. There hasn't quite been the full recovery if that bit's not quite been fractured. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very, very helpful. And I think there's a link there with what Rambo is on about. That's too easy a retelling of the Christian story leaves the trauma sufferer behind. But I think what I'm trying to get at is the riches that can be found in a full contemplation of the Passion, and it would have to include, as you say, the way in which some people's narratives are so fractured that their identity is broken, and I believe that I believe the whole story of Christ's life, in a sense, is of a recognition of that, that he is always working with and alongside people who were not able, for one reason or other, to be themselves. So I think his compassion is always present to those people. But you make a very good point there, that these things want a lot of nuancing, as you say.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, just I wanted to ask a question of clarification. You mentioned about the three lens seeing, and I thought that was really helpful. Did those lenses of creation and then the kind of eschatological life without tears and pain, did those correlate at all with kind of the ironic and then charismatic narratives that you were talking about at the beginning? And does the cross kind of form like a dialectical relationship between those two?
I think it's possible to see ironic narratives as trapped in the first lens, if you see what I mean, and perhaps, as I was saying, over-realized comic narratives as being trapped in the third. And what's so important about those lenses is that they're held together, that they're synoptic lenses.
Mm. Yeah, and just Helen's question in the chat, do these three lenses exist simultaneously, or is there a cycle like Brueggemann's orientation, disorientation, reorientation?
I think there are links to Brueggemann's work, but I would want to. I mean, and it's, in disorientation, it would be possible to lose touch with one or more of those lenses for sure. But my suggestion is that the healthy reflection of a community will always involve all those lenses together.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Do we have other questions? We have time for a few more. Yes, Julene, would you like to?
Yeah. So what I'm thinking is, and I haven't thought about it quite this way before, but I'm part of an Indigenous community here in the States of the Blackfeet. And I'm thinking that with us, we have historical trauma, Indigenous historical trauma, centuries. And then I was thinking, well, Jesus does too, or did that. It's like he's alive now. And so with all the trauma that the Jewish people experienced, as we see in the Old Testament, and then with the Roman occupation and so forth, and so much trauma. So I'm thinking about Jesus identifying with Indigenous people, and that helps me to see that bringing Jesus closer to the ways that Indigenous people have experienced trauma. Yeah, I guess it's more of a comment there, but I don't know. Have you heard much, seen much about Indigenous trauma?
I think that's extremely helpful perception, if I may say so, and that link. The fact that Jesus in his life will have inhabited those scriptures I was talking about with all their trauma burden. I think that's a really helpful perception, and could be applied, as you were saying, to the spirituality of Indigenous people. I've been very shocked just in the last few years by starting to glean more of those stories of the Indigenous peoples of the United States and the way in which they were treated. I was in the Museum of the History of New Mexico, and I could hardly, although I had a kind of vague understanding, to see the history laid out in more detail, I found deeply, deeply shocking. And part of what the United States has so to struggle with is that history, and is the way in which promise and opportunity was at the expense of people who were so deceived and betrayed. And so I think that's it's a very important part of the history of that, of the spiritual context of that country. But I think the link that you began by making, Julene, I think is a very rich one, and I hope you'll explore it some more. That yes, that Jesus' imagination was formed out of all that struggle and all that defeat and all that having to embrace it with a larger heart. Yes.
Right, right. That's what I'm thinking, is that Jesus very fully knew all this struggle and so forth. And so that the fracturing that went with that as well, fracturing of nationhood, fracturing of community, as well as then fracturing of personhood in ways that Indigenous people know very well. So that gives a lot to think about. Thank you.
Yes, and that whole inhabiting of the scriptures, I guess, is what makes possible his what I would think of as his self-identification with the suffering servant, which is an important part of those texts as well.
Well, I think that we have unfortunately run out of time, even though I could listen to Professor Southgate talk for much longer, and I wish that we could. But before we end, I would like to, give Professor Southgate a round of applause. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. Now, before we get going, it wouldn't be a proper academic gathering if we didn't end with some notices. So just to remind you that tomorrow our conference continues at 1 p.m. British Standard Summer Time with a session on trauma and scriptural interpretation, kind of part 2 of this conversation we've been having tonight, with presentations from Juliana Claessens and Brent Strong. In the evening at 7 p.m. British Summer Time, there is a panel discussion. I'm very excited about this panel discussion on the topic of restorative justice. Should the church get involved? We'll be hearing from Valerie Hobbs, Sam Heath, and Nathan Cartagena. And as Ashley mentioned at the beginning, there is so much going on at the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. We have our own journal, JSBV, that is currently accepting submissions. We have an exciting new book series with Routledge Press on Bible and violence, and we are accepting proposals for that as well. And if you would like to find out more about these and everything else we're doing, if you want to get involved, and if you would like to donate to the work of the center, you can find that all on our website, csbvbristol.org.uk.